Good evening. I would like to call this meeting of the Southbridge School Committee to order at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, February 11th, 2025 in Council Chambers. I will go ahead and do roll call. Brittany Davison is excused. Carla De La Cruz Davila.
Present.
Frank Kepinski.
Present.
Martina Shea.
Present.
Maria Torres.
Present.
Norma Tesnick.
Present.
And Andrew Murch is present. We have a quorum. Agenda item number 2, the Pledge of Allegiance.
Flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's go with some justice.
Moving on to agenda item number 3, approve the minutes from the January 14th meeting.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion or edits? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It is unanimous of all present. We will move on to agenda item number 4, public input. Is there any member of the public who would like to speak to the school committee tonight? Seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item number 5, a presentation from Ms. Tracy Novick with the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, 70 minutes on Chapter 70.
Good evening. It's good to be with you again. And you all are familiar faces. Welcome to those of you who are new in terms of getting sworn in. I'm always, one of course of our priorities is always to make sure that people are trained, and we know that you all sort of came in and we're already in the middle of creating the operating protocols, and I know that you'll be planning to come to charting the course in a couple of weeks, so that's wonderful. I know for those of you who've been serving for a bit, you may recall that I actually have been here before you to present on Chapter 70. Something that I think has actually been particularly valuable for a number of committees. First of all, it's a complicated formula, so going through it more than once doesn't hurt. But also because of the Student Opportunity Act, and particularly for districts like Southbridge, the changes have been pretty profound in terms of the foundation budget. So my hope is that all of this is going to give you some insight into how the changes have been rolling out in terms of how they've impacted Southbridge and kind of where that has put you. Let me also just apologize in advance. I am on week 3 of recovering from the flu, so if I start to cough, it isn't you, and I'm not dying of tuberculosis. It's just that that's the lingering part that still is happening. So this is actually a presentation on why we have Chapter 70, what it is, how it works, how it doesn't work, and what's changing in particular at this point. So when we talk about school funding in Massachusetts, one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is that we've had schools in Massachusetts by American standards for a very long time. And so, of course, you may be able to picture in your head Plymouth Rock, which says 1620 on it, which was the founding of the English settlement at Plymouth. The Mass Bay Colony was founded in 1630, and Boston Latin School, the oldest school in the country, was founded in 1635. So essentially we get the Pilgrims, and then 15 years later we already have a public school. Harvard College, by the way, was founded the next year in 1636. The first public education law in the entire country was passed in the Mass Bay Colony in 1647. It rejoices in the name, the Old Deluder Satan Act. Any of you who have perhaps older relatives who may have said idle hands are the devil's workshop or have ever heard that phrase, that is exactly what the Mass Bay Colony was concerned of. As we were rolling out English settlement across what became the colony of Massachusetts, there was concern that children in the settlements, first of all, might come into contact with Native Americans, and of course the English settlers were very concerned about that influence. But in general, that if they weren't kept busy, they might be up to no good. And so we have the first then public education law in Massachusetts. Now, this actually matters for a couple of reasons. First is that as soon as there was a settlement of 50 families in Massachusetts, the requirement was that they create what we would think of as an elementary school. And as soon as there were 100 families, they were required to create what we would think of as a high school. That's preparing the middle-class white boys to enter Harvard College, which of course had started in 1636. Now, the part that was revolutionary, and frankly, if you look at how education is funded internationally, is honestly still kind of revolutionary, was that it was not the responsibility exclusively of those responsible individually for the children to ensure that there was a school. It was the responsibility, as the law puts it, by the inhabitants in general by way of supply. In other words, it was actually the responsibility of the settlement together, of the town together, to make sure that there was the provision of a school and a school teacher. Now, part of the reason that we know that this wasn't just sort of something they passed and then it sort of stayed in the books and no one did anything with it, is that you can go back into the town meeting minutes of some of our towns in Massachusetts and actually find places where they were not, in fact, providing a public school. I will offer my own hometown of Worcester as an example. You can go back into the town meeting minutes of Worcester, when Worcester was still a town, and find years in which Worcester did not, in fact, have a school teacher. And they were fined by the Mass Bay Colony for not having a school teacher. And the minutes are kind of funny because they sort of grumble about the fact that they have to pay the fine, and then they have to find the money to actually pay the school teacher. Some things never change. Nonetheless, it was a value of English settlers in Massachusetts from very, very early days. Now, of course, the other thing that this does is it puts the responsibility on the local community to fund schools. Which brings me to my second point, which is that because Massachusetts does this so early, predating most towns, predating certainly the state, predating the country, we kind of settle ourselves into this notion of it's the local community that funds public education. And Massachusetts, once it gets there, kind of gets stuck. And I was reading a book this summer, Matthew Gardner Kelly's book on school finance in California, and he had this great quote from Fletcher Smith, who was writing about Massachusetts, and he says, "No other state pursued so long and so completely the policy of placing almost the entire burden of school support on local communities." And if you look across the country, Massachusetts, and frankly, New England in general, gets very stuck on this idea of it's the local community that funds schools. It's not a state responsibility. It's not a larger responsibility. We don't sort of create larger school districts. And we're very unusual in terms of that. And I do think that it at least in part dates back to the fact that we were creating schools so early that we kind of hadn't gotten very much else going yet. So anyway, in any case, this is sort of the way that Massachusetts develops public schools really right alongside English settlement across the colony. Now, Massachusetts, of course, then is part of the early days of the American Revolution. And as that rolls forward, and prior really to the settlement of the Treaty of Paris, which, by the way, you have a copy of the Treaty of Paris over here on the wall, which I thought was interesting. Treaty of Paris isn't signed until 1783, ending the Revolutionary War, but Massachusetts actually calls a constitutional convention for the state in 1779. All right, I'm going to tell you this story because you all serve on a committee, and I think this is entertaining because I've served on committees. So they call a constitutional convention. They call it in Cambridge. Everybody sends their representatives from across the state. Not state yet, colony. And it happens that John Adams is actually home from Europe. He spends most of the war in Europe raising money to fund the revolution. And Braintree sends him. And so they do exactly what every committee you've ever served on that has a responsibility to do something does. In fact, honestly, it's even what you did with your protocols, right? Which is that you appoint a subcommittee. Okay, so the Constitutional Convention appoints a subcommittee, come back with a draft of the Constitution. And what does the subcommittee do? They look at each other and they say, "John, you've done a lot of writing on, legal systems and things. Why don't you go write us a draft?" And so John Adams ends up home from Europe, ends up writing a draft of the Massachusetts Constitution. This section actually gets passed without any amendments. It's passed as he wrote it. And it is the first state to have language in the state constitution that actually speaks of public education. We have the oldest written constitution that's still functioning as a state. But there's two things I think that matter in terms of this. The first is that we have public education in the Constitution because essentially the way that Adam sets up the government is he says, okay, so we're going to have, we're going to have the executive branch, we're going to have the legislative branch, we're going to have the judiciary, and then we need to have a way to actually fill all of these roles once those of us who thought up all of these bright ideas die. And if we don't have a functioning public education system, we're not going to have people who are prepared to actually take those positions. So that's why we have public education. The second is whose job it is, and this is what matters in terms of school funding, is that it's the duty of legislators and magistrates. So legislators is exactly what we would call legislators now, the state legislature. Magistrates is the executive branch, okay? So it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that there are public schools in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, interestingly, though he writes this and they pass it, it doesn't actually really substantially change how we fund public schools for a very, very, very long time. In fact, until really my own lifetime. So there are two things that happen in the course of the 1970s and then the 1980s that end up sort of bringing things to a head in terms of how Massachusetts funds public schools. The first is that Massachusetts passes what we now call Chapter 766, which is the special education law. We are a year ahead of the country in terms of that. The federal government will pass IDEA, which is now turning 50. And this provides, very responsibly, the idea that the school districts have a responsibility to educate every child, regardless of their needs. Entirely appropriate, exactly the kind of thing that I think that we all hold as a standard. However, it's not cheap. The thing that then subsequently happens in the 1980s is that Massachusetts passes a ballot question, we generally think of this, which is now generally referred to as Proposition 2.5, which caps the amount that local communities can raise property taxes without going to sort of extra kinds of steps. As you can imagine, these two are immediately at loggerheads. We've got rising educational costs coming into conflict with local abilities having limited capacity to actually increase their local funding. And as a result, a number of school children across the Commonwealth file suit against the state based on the constitutional language. These come together in a lawsuit known as McDuffie. McDuffie was a school child in the city of Brockton. Her father served on the Brockton School Committee. Last I checked, she's actually still a school teacher in the city of Brockton. And the Supreme Judicial Court found in favor of the plaintiffs, the children, saying that the constitutional language was not merely aspirational or hortatory, but obligatory. In other words, the state had to do something with this language. They didn't just get to sort of say, these are nice words. And particularly, the state had a responsibility to provide an education for every child, rich and poor, in every city and town in the Commonwealth at the public school level. And then McDuffie does reiterate the reason that we're doing this is not only for the good of the children, but also for the good of the state. So the legislature then is sort of left with this quandary. Well, now you've got to figure this out. And they pass what we know as the 1993 Education Reform Law. You may have most often heard this referred to in reference to the MCAS exam. It is actually a school funding law. It is a school funding law because the state actually lost a lawsuit. And I think that that's a really important principle to hold when we think about 1993 education reform. So included in 1993 education reform is Mass General Law Chapter 70, Section 1, and a few of the other following sections, which outlines a system of funding schools that is standard across the state. And it says that the state is going to do two things, subject to appropriation, always that tricky term in there in terms of whether or not we're going to get the full funding. But they're going to define a foundation budget, and they're going to provide a standard of local funding applicable to every city and town in the Commonwealth. A complicated thing. And so when we talk about the Chapter 70 calculation being complicated, part of the reason is because we're trying to do something that's actually kind of hard. In any case, if you've ever wondered why we refer to state aid for public education as Chapter 70, it's because that's actually the section of the law that describes it. There are a number of other things that are in Chapter 70. Most of them have to do with school funding, but that outline of how state aid for public education works is in the first couple of sections. So as I said, the two parts of the question are outlining this foundation budget and then coming up with a standard local funding effort calculation. So we're going to take the first part of this question first. How much does it cost to educate a child and educate in Massachusetts? Now, as I mentioned to you, one of the things that is currently happening is that we have the first really major revision of the foundation budget since its inception in 1993 as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. Governor Baker signed the Student Opportunity Act into law in November of 2019. And that is as a result of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, which came out with their report in 2015. So it did take 4 years for the legislature, for both houses of the legislature, I should say. The Senate passed it, I believe, 7 times, to pass the funding reform. Both chambers did eventually pass the Student Opportunity Act unanimously. Now, the initial plan was for this to change, to phase in over 7 years. However, Governor Baker signed this in the fall of 1999. You may remember what happened in the spring of 2019. And so months later, in fact, after he had initially filed his governor's budget, but before we got to the House's budget, we had COVID. And everything shut down. The state did not actually pass a budget until the fall, and they did not actually do the first year of implementation. Due in part to a lot of advocacy from MASC, MASS, MTA, AFT, MASBO, we did get the legislature to agree to a 6-year implementation, so they didn't sort of keep the 7 years and push it off a year. They stayed to having it finish at the same time and implementing it in 6 years instead. So for FY26, which is the fiscal year that will start July 1st, is year 5 of the 6-year implementation. Within the foundation budget, and I'm going to highlight 4 things here because these were what were actually in the Foundation Budget Review Commission. There are 4 reforms, and I'll highlight each of these when we get to that section as well. There's a separate inflation rate for health insurance. We'll talk about why that matters in a second. There's an increase in the in-district special education percentage, an increase in the dollar amount per pupil for English learners, and an increase in the dollar amount per pupil for low-income students. Now, if I were to ask you sitting here to take a pad of paper and make a list of what you needed in order to actually educate a child, thinking of the kinds of things that are in your budget, I think that you probably would come up with a list that would look something like this. Note that this lacks transportation. So this is what the finance people refer to as the chart of accounts. It's actually how your school district reports actual funding back to the department every year. Sometimes this is referred to as the 1,000 level way of thinking of schools, so the 1,000 level, the 2,000 level, and so forth. But these are the categories that are included. There's a dollar amount per pupil that was calculated when we put the foundation budget together that is associated with each of these things. So if you think of a kindergartner needs a teacher, and the school district, that school needs a principal, that student needs a building that's heated, they need student supplies, and so forth. You can pretty much go down the list here in terms of coming up with that. Those dollar amounts added together come together in what's known as the base foundation amount. And again, this is a per pupil basis. For your foundation budget, that's always based on the prior year's October 1 count. So every year in the fall, that sort of month or so into school, every school district in Massachusetts reports to the state and says, this is the number of kindergartners we have, this is the number of first graders we have, and so forth. It's that October 1 report that then is used to create your foundation budget for the following year. So the FY26 budget, the one that will start on July 1, is based on October 1 numbers of 2024. So yes, there's always a year lag, okay? For FY26, these are the dollar amounts. Now keep in mind that within this, this includes the increases in the foundation budget. There's a small amount increasing in terms of guidance and psychological services. That was an addition, actually. Included in this is that inflation rate that's separate for health insurance. That's included in the base foundation amount and so forth. Now, to that base foundation amount, there's actually 2 numbers that are added. One is the low income increment, and the second, Actually, the other one is supposed to be the English learner increment, and I'm not sure why that's both called the low income increment. Sorry about that. The English learner increment is heading towards a goal rate that was set as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. So these are increasing each year towards a goal rate in the legislation that was signed by Baker in 2019. The innovation here that I think matters the most is the fact that the grades 9 through 12 rate is now the highest. Previously, that was not the case. And this is a recognition of the fact that if you only have that limited amount sort of left with a student, it's that much more important that you make sure that they have all that they need in order to support their acquisition of English. The other thing that's moving towards a goal rate that will be fully implemented next year is the low income increment. Now, if you look at the bottom, I think you probably can see that there are 12 low income groups. They're done by the percentage of students you have in your school district that are recognized as low income. A big push of the Foundation Budget Review Commission was the recognition that if you have a high concentration of low income students, the needs that the school district needs to be able to support are that much greater, and consequently that much more expensive. In your case, you're actually low income group 12. That's 80% or more low income students in your school district. Now, generally, one of the questions that I get asked is, how is it that we actually determine a student is considered low income? Some of you might remember free and reduced lunch forms. Once upon a time, that was how we did it. Something that happened during the Obama administration is that there was an innovation through the United States Department of Agriculture that if your school district had a high enough concentration of students who were eligible for free lunch, it was possible through federal reimbursement to end up feeding all of your students for free for them with full federal reimbursement. As school districts moved to that who had high concentrations of poverty, Boston was one of the first. Springfield went very early. Those districts no longer had to collect forms. That was also how the state had actually been figuring out their low income rate. And so they were using for the cities whatever they were using to actually calculate their federal free lunch calculation, and then they were using the forms for everyone else, and eventually the department said, enough, we can't run two different systems. So in FY17, they moved to an economically disadvantaged designation, and they moved essentially everyone to direct certification. Direct certification is that if a student is enrolled in a state program like Mass Health or SNAP, there is a matching that happens between that database and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's database. If the student is found in both databases, that student is designated as low income. Now, when this was implemented, naturally there were students who maybe had been filling in the forms but weren't found in the databases, so there was a drop in the sort of number. They'd actually increase the dollar amount. The department has worked very, very hard to increase the accuracy of the matching system, which has actually gone a long way to bringing us back up to potentially a more accurate number. As a result of the Student Opportunity Act, the districts also now can use a supplemental process if there are students in the district that they know to be or think to be eligible for low income but are not actually designated within the state systems. And that supplemental system using supporting documentation has been increasingly successful as well. We've also switched terminology again. The other piece that gets sort of added in here in terms of the foundation budget is special education. Now, special education is the only section of this that's not actually based on the number of students who are receiving services. So for English learners, it's the number of students who are actually designated as English learners in your district. For low-income students, as we saw, it's in students who are actually within those databases or have followed through the supplemental process. For special education, it is a 1% assumed of your total enrollment for out-of-district special education services. And for this year, it's 3.97% for in-district special education services. The second one is moving to 4% as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. So we're in that 5th year of the implementation. It will move to 4% next year. Now, the first thing that you are probably thinking is that's not even close to the percentage of students we have in special education. Please note that that's because this is a full-time equivalency. So most of your students who receive special education services do not spend all of their time receiving special education services. Statewide, the average is somewhere around 18% of students. If you took those 18% of students and sort of squished their schedules into the full-time equivalency, it would be about 4%. I'm not saying that's perfect either, but that is how we do it. I always make sure that we designate that before we get to the dollar amount, because the dollar amounts are higher. But of course, it's not actually based on the number of students that you have on IEPs. So the other thing that goes into building the foundation budget is an inflation rate. And we see lots of headlines about inflation. The inflation rate that's used for the foundation budget is not the inflation rate that you see lots of headlines about. It's not based on a basket of services. It's not based on any of those kinds of things. What it is the rate of change in the implicit price deflator index for state and local governments, which is, what it is that the United States Department of Commerce actually tracks spending of states, of cities and towns, and of school districts. And it measures how much that changes from one part of the year to another. When the foundation budget was established and created, what the creators of it decided to do was to tie the sort of increases to something that had sort of something to do with how schools spend money. And so they chose this implicit price deflator. So from one fall to the next, the rate of change is what then becomes our inflation rate. And by the way, I was wondering if this was one of the web pages that had been taken down, because it's the United States Department. It was still up as of yesterday. I did check. So a couple of notes on this. That's all well and good, but then think about what happens when we have something like ESSER funding and ARPA funding. So we have a whole bunch of federal funding that rolls out to states and to towns and to school districts, and all of those spend all of this money. So that means that the rate of change in our spending goes up that much larger, right? Well, when we passed the Student Opportunity Act actually capped inflation at 4.5%. So you'll notice that for FY23 and FY24, the inflation rate is 4.5%. If we had used what the actual calculation was, it would have been more like 7 or 8% for those 2 years. Now, the second thing, of course, that happened is that then we spent all of that money, just like we were supposed to. It timed out. And that meant that the increases in spending suddenly were much smaller. And so then last year we ended up with an inflation rate of 1.35%, and this year we have an inflation rate of 1.93%, which is much smaller. Generally, by the way, as a rule of thumb, school district costs go up by about 3% a year, and that's sort of like averaged across all of your cost categories. So any year in which that's not the case. Now, there obviously are lots of categories in which it goes up by more. One of the things is health insurance, and that was brought forward as part of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. So you might remember that one of the reforms of the Student Opportunity Act is that health insurance has its own inflation rate. So previously, health insurance would have gotten the same percent here. For FY26, the inflation rate is 6.13%. That's based on the 3-year average for the state GIC rate. And then, as I noted, the rate is capped at 4.5% since FY22. That will, I imagine, by the way, be part of advocacy from MASC, MASS, MTA, AFT, which it was last year. So if all that was happening was just we had the foundation budget, as we did prior to SOA, the changes that you would see from one year to the next would be changes in enrollment, right? You have a different number of kindergartners this year than you did last year. You have more English learners in middle school than you did last year. You have a higher or lower number of low-income students. And then the other thing that would change would be the inflation rate. Like, that has been a change every year. Now, we also have the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, for one more year after FY26, which obviously is also part of the changes that are happening in the foundation budget. So for the Southbridge Public Schools in FY26, this is what your foundation budget is, right? There's a spreadsheet I could have sort of cut and pasted in here, but I've just boiled it down to sort of the numbers you need to make the multiplication work. The number of students you have in preschool, note, by the way, for preschool, it's a 50% count, so your actual head count would be twice this. Full day K, elementary, middle, high. And then the reason that in district sped and below are in italics is to save you from trying to add the enrollment column all the way to the bottom. So the English learners that are K through 5 are all up in those elementary categories, already counted as a student as well. Same thing with your low income students. And that gives you a total of $43.3 million. Now I would note, although I was beaten to it actually because Juan noted this the day that you guys went through charting the course, most districts in Massachusetts do spend more than this. The statewide average is about 28% more than the foundation budget. I believe that your school district spends pretty close to the foundation budget, as does my own for that matter. Now, if the things that particularly matter in putting the foundation budget together are inflation, which we've already looked at, and your enrollment categories, obviously taking a look at your enrollment matters. So this is the Southbridge Public Schools enrollment dating back to 1995. So you'll see that you've had a decline in the number of students. Obviously that matters in terms of your foundation budget, right? Enrollment is, the per pupil amount is actually what underlies the entire foundation budget. And then the other thing that matters is what we think of as selected populations. And so if we go through those, this is what your English learner count has gone through. You're at up to 19% at this point. And that's from a low of some places in the early 2000s of less than 4%. That's a pretty significant change for a school district to be supporting. Low income, now obviously there's been a change, that slide there that happens from 76.3% to 60%. There's a star there because that was when they changed how they were counting. Note that this does get you up over 80%. Remember the group 12 is actually 80% or more. That really, I would say, is easily your biggest change because you were below 40% in 1995. And then the green line is students with disabilities. Now, obviously, that doesn't actually change your foundation budget because it's an assumed percentage, but it does, of course, change what you're actually spending money on. So it's a good thing to keep a perspective on. That one hasn't, while it has certainly changed, you've kind of ended up pretty close to where you actually started. Now, if those are the things that actually influence your foundation budget, this then is your foundation budget. And let me note for you that, now you can actually see the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act sort of with this very steep climb towards the end. That's the low income implementation really pushing through in terms of your foundation budget. That makes more difference, honestly, than anything else for your foundation budget. I did outline, I think it's a little hard to see, there's a couple of years where your foundation budget for 1 year is actually lower than the prior year. That would have been because of declining enrollment, okay? And so like you can see that, for example, in FY20 moving to FY21, that $30 million is more than the $29.9 of the subsequent year. So if we're going to come up with this foundation budget then, the next thing we have to figure out then is how are you going to pay for it? Who's going to come up with the money in order to pay for it? And to do that, we're going to back ourselves back out to the full state level. So if you think of the total foundation budget for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? Southbridge's foundation budget, Worcester's foundation budget, Bay Pass foundation budget, if you add those all up together, the underlying principle is that the foundation budget is intended to be funded 59% through local funding, 41% through state funding. I will say that this is often when people stop me and say, but I thought you said it was the state's responsibility, and that would be something to take up with the state. This is actually written into law in the Student Opportunity Act. It actually has been how we have been functioning long prior to that, but it did actually come into play in that. So if we sort of take that whole foundation budget, we've got the 41% that's state funded, we sort of set that aside, and now we're looking at how do you come up with that 59%. The state's going to use two things in order to come up with that 59%. The first is the equalized valuation, which is the full and fair cash value of all taxable property in every municipality. So imagine that then for not only Southbridge, but for every single town and city all added up together, right? Equalized valuation. And then the second thing that that the state's going to use is income, which is pulled right from the DOR when people actually file their income taxes. So, if the local share, the local contribution, is 59% of the entire foundation budget for the whole Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? We know how much that is. Okay, it's about $9 billion. Now, the other thing that is written into SOA, which has actually been part of how we do this since 2007, is that the state had established as a principle that no community would be required to fund more than 82.5% of their foundation budget. That was what's called the maximum local contribution, okay? So, if $9 billion is 82.5% of something, of the whole amount, of the 100%, right? We're going to solve for X. And you thought you never were going to use algebra ever again. The statewide combined effort yield then is $12.6 billion, okay? And what that is the 100% of the $9 billion being 82.5, okay? This, by the way, is easily the hardest thing that I actually ever explained. So if we have this $12.6 billion that we somehow have to put together from across the state, right? You remember that we're pulling from two things, property value and income that's reported. We're going to split it half and half. We're going to pull value half from property and half from income, okay? And so we just divided the $12.6 billion half and half. Now we know how much taxable property there is in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's this really big number here at the top. And we know how much income has been reported for the entirety of Massachusetts. By the way, we're actually using 22 numbers for this. I didn't actually change my DOR number here. Now, if we have to take each of these values and we have to get them each to the same point, that $6.3 billion, okay, we're again going to solve for X. Okay, what do you have to multiply each of them by? Now, the reason that I walk you through this complicated equation, okay, which is sort of just done in the spreadsheet that DESE sends out when it does the governor's budget, is because what's going to happen is you're going to see these decimals then appear when we're figuring out how much Southbridge is supposed to contribute to its public schools. And also, those same decimals are used for Boston, and for Worcester, and for Paxton, and for every city and town in Massachusetts. So this is the standard local funding effort that they use, is we're going to take these two decimals that we used to set property and income equal to each other, and we're going to use them for every city and every town in Massachusetts. And if I didn't walk you through that, you might idly wonder where it is that those decimals came from. So if we're going to talk about Southbridge then, for 2024, the equalized valuation was $1.76 billion. There's your uniform property percentage, right? You've already seen that. There's that friendly 3 number. It's actually, I didn't change it on the right. It's correct in the spreadsheet. Sorry about that. So that gives you $5.7 million of effort to contribute to schools coming in from the property side. We're going to do the same thing with income. Right, you've got about this $446 million. Same decimal, and I'm wondering if I changed, this one I did change, that 1.5699. That gives you $7 million in effort. We're going to add those two together to give a combined effort yield. So this is a standard measurement of how much a community can afford to put towards public education. So for the town of Southbridge, that's about $12.7 million. Okay. So now we're going to go back and we're going to say, okay, but we have a foundation budget. Now here's the trick. You all aren't the only game in town when it comes to the foundation budget for the town of Southbridge, because the town of Southbridge is also a member of Bay Path Regional. And they have a foundation budget too, and all of their towns have a required local contribution for them as well. Those two things added together are the town of Southbridge's foundation budget, okay? So it's not just you all K through 12, it's also the Bay Path contribution. That's why their foundation budget is $48.8 million, as opposed to the number that we had actually been using for you earlier. Now, we said already, no community is required to contribute more than 82.5% of their foundation budget. For, if you're taking that 48.8, that means 82.5% of that is $40 million. We're going to compare that, though, to your combined effort yield, because we did this calculation, and what we said was that the town of Southbridge, their local capacity to fund was actually $12.7 million, right? And so you always pick the lower of those two. In the case of Southbridge, the lower is actually the combined effort yield rather than the 82.5%. So what that means, we're then going to take that $12.7 million and we're going to translate that into what percentage of your foundation budget is that. And in the case of Southbridge, it's 26.07%. Now, this is what the state calls your target, which is they're trying to get you to contribute 26.7%, 26.07% of your foundation budget, okay? But they also are going to acknowledge the fact that this is coming from somewhere. Now, something that is a useful thing to then be keeping in mind is when you're talking about this sort of adequate minimum of the foundation budget, close to 75% of it is funded by the state. Okay, is actually the target. With 26%, at least in terms of the target, it's going to be less than that in a minute, coming from local funding capacity. Now, the next step in the calculation is that the state's going to say, okay, so we've got that 26% that we're aiming towards, but how much did Southbridge have to contribute last year to public schools? Because, of course, we run this calculation every year. And the answer is $10.6 million. And then the next number that the state pulls from the Department of Revenue is something called the Municipal Revenue Growth Factor, which is exactly what it says on the lid. It's the growth in your municipal revenue over the course of the year. And in the case of Southbridge, that's 3.01%. Now, I've started talking more about the Municipal Revenue Growth Factor because I've noticed that we get very stuck on the 2.5% of Proposition 2.5. And I think it's really important to know that when the state actually runs the calculation of how much your local required contribution grows, they don't stop with the 2.5%. That's part of it, but that's not the whole story, okay? So if we take the municipal revenue growth factor, we multiply it by how much you had to contribute, the town had to contribute last year, we've got the $10.9 million, almost $11 million. This is what actually goes into the municipal revenue growth factor. It's not just the 2.5% of the state imposed levy limit, it's also new growth, it's also state aid, and it's also prior year local receipts. If you're interested in looking into that or you feel like this is a conversation that needs to be had locally, you can actually pull the municipal revenue growth factor chart straight off of the Department of Revenue's website. This is the 26th version for Southbridge. You'll see, you might be able to tell at the bottom, it says that 3.01%, but it actually runs you through all of the numbers that gets you there in terms of how it is that they're coming up with that calculation. Something that I've been finding useful for districts to look at also is how that may have changed over time. So last year you had a particularly high municipal revenue growth factor. 6% is usually pretty high in terms of that. And then the next step of the calculation in terms of how much local communities are required to contribute is to look at where that number, so we got you all to 10.99 million, is compared to that percent target that we established, right? You remember it's a little bit over 26%. And depending on how close you are to the target, they may move you up or down. Now let me note this. Because we've had the foundation budget changing as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, the foundation budgets of most districts are increasing. That's supposed to be what's happening, right? That's what's happening as a result of SOA. but they're increasing at a rate that is much greater than their municipal revenue growth factors. Okay, so that means that you've got one number growing a whole lot faster than the other. That means that just about every school district, every town in Massachusetts is below target. Sometimes people think that when we start talking about below target, there's some sort of like a moral judgment here of like, you're below target. That means somebody screwed up. It doesn't mean that at all. It's just math, okay? It means that one number is going faster than the other. And I mean, we did that on purpose because we actually implemented the Student Opportunity Act. Like, that's fine. Just realize that it means that just about every district, I mean, from my perspective, when I think about it in terms of the spreadsheet, it means just about everybody has this calculation that's happening here at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So the upper right is exactly what we've already walked through, which is the required local contribution last year of the $10.6 million increased by the municipal revenue growth factor of 3.01, which gets you to that $10,000,099. That percentage, so what percentage is that of your foundation budget? It's 22.52% of your foundation budget. Now you might remember when we did the pie chart, right, you were at 26.06. So you're below target. Again, as is just about everybody in Massachusetts. It's actually, when I'm doing examples with sort of people who want to learn this in general, it's actually really hard for me to find people who are above target right now. So what we do then is we look at how short you are and what percentage that is of your foundation budget. It's 3.55. And so if your shortfall is between 2.5 and 7.5%, it adds 1% to your local contribution, which is where you're at. So it pushes your local contribution up a bit, and that leaves you at a local required contribution of $11.1 million, which is 22.74% of foundation. And again, as I said, this is your standard local funding effort. If you're interested in what that ends up looking like in a pie chart, I did not change it. That's no good. Anyway, you'll notice that if we go back, though, you will realize that we had said that your target was 26.07, and you actually end up contributing 22.74%. I will change that pie chart before I send it to you. Now, if we're going to put the pieces together, right, we're trying to get you to the foundation budget. We're going to have that local contribution come in first, okay? And then the state is then going to fill the gap between your required local contribution and getting you to foundation. Now, you might remember we still were talking about the town of Southbridge a minute ago, right? So that $11.1 million is mostly coming to you all, but that's also partly covering, Southbridge is going to have the same target for Bay Path that it does here, sort of essentially 22% of the foundation budget for Bay Path for the town of Southbridge. So for FY26, again, for the public schools, okay, you're just short of $45 million in terms of your foundation budget. Your required local contribution, it's $10 million coming here. And then the state is going to fill the gap between the $10 million and the 44 with Chapter 78. And that's where your Chapter 78 comes from. I think in many cases, kind of everybody, not just school committees, are a little puzzled as to where that number comes from. And it is important to know that the first step is that calculation of the foundation budget, but then it's a calculation of the local community's ability to contribute to schools, which leads districts in wildly different places, okay? Now, something that I did think was important to note for you all, a lot of the headlines, in fact, one of the ones that I even cited here, around the Student Opportunity Act were about gateway cities. And, you know, it was going to be Holyoke, it was going to be Lawrence, it was going to be Springfield, it was going to be Worcester that were the big winners. Because of the rate of poverty in particular for Southbridge, you are among those who have seen major increases, okay? So going back to as far as FY06, this is your local required contribution that far back, this is what your state aid has looked like. Okay, and those increases then towards the end there are where you've actually seen those big increases as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. So that's the foundation budget has gone up and you are a majority state-funded district. Okay, so those two things together have to be in play in order for there to be the major increases in state aid. If you just were seeing the increases in the foundation budget, but somehow could capture them locally, like say Boston, you wouldn't necessarily be seeing these increases in state aid. Now, the other thing that I want to call to your attention, I hope you can see it from there, is if you look at fiscal year 21, you may note that the yellow line is actually below the green bar, right? Your foundation budget is actually less than the total of your local contribution and your state aid. So if we go back to fiscal year 21, I want to talk to you about what was going on there because it also is part of the Student Opportunity Act story, not only for you, but also for a lot of other districts, okay? So in fiscal year 21 in Southbridge, you had a foundation budget that was about $30 million, right? Exactly the same thing happened, right? We've got an $8 million local contribution. State fills the gap, $21.9 million. Now, the trick is this, and I believe this was actually, I mean, there were actually two things happening. This is also the year where everything went haywire because of COVID. But you also, of course, had that declining enrollment, right? And we hadn't yet had the pickup of the Student Opportunity Act. So if you had only received the $21.9 million in Chapter 78, that would have been less aid than you had gotten the year before. And another principle that the state has held, for better or worse, is that no district will get less state aid than they got the year before. And so you were held harmless to the tune of about $1 million that year. Now, when that happens, the state says, you gotta spend all of your state aid, right? So the 21 plus the other million. But it ends up meaning that your required net school spending is higher than your foundation budget. Now, you end up sort of pushing straight out of that because then we get into the Student Opportunity Act. You actually are a high poverty district. You've got increases that are happening that push you out of that. I do just want to kind of generally put on your radar screen as sort of informed school committee members that there's a lot of districts that have had this happen and then essentially get trapped there. And then all that they're going to get for increases from one year to the next are the minimum per pupil increases. You may have seen those in terms of headlines. They're very unpopular, although I think that most people wouldn't like the alternative, which is only getting the amount of foundation aid that you'd be getting. So do realize that that's another side benefit of the Student Opportunity Act. When it can overcome inflation, which for some districts it hasn't been able to. But that's part of your story as well, which is that it not only sort of gave you these state aid increases, it also did push you out of hold harmless. And those are all the slides that I have for you this evening, though I'm obviously happy to take questions, and I also will be sure and actually share this with you, although I will change the one thing that's wrong in terms of the slides.
Does any member of the body have questions for Ms. Novick? Ms. Shea?
I know it's early times, but there are changes in Washington. Is the state looking to, are they already looking to, I don't want to use the word subsidize, but to make us whole, especially I'm thinking of food lunches.
So, excellent question. The first thing to know in terms of school lunches is that I do think, I know that you all know better partly because of where your funding comes from, that there is sort of this general notion abroad that, Massachusetts has universal free lunch now and that somehow the state's picking up the bill. The state's actually picking up a supplement, right? So the free and reduced lunch program as it was running is continuing to run. For a lot of cities in particular, that means it's fully funded by the federal government. It's actually a supplement on top of that that's funding it everywhere else. The one headline that I've seen looking at federal funding for Massachusetts and sort of the state responding was that I know the executive branch last week did ask departments to look at how much of their funding actually came from the federal government. They did specify that there shouldn't be an expectation that the state was going to make up the difference. Now, I don't know that I haven't seen anything that has asked outside of the state government, of course, which would be school districts. I would never say never, but I would be surprised if Massachusetts felt that it had the capacity to make up the amount of federal aid that school districts get in Massachusetts, both in terms of, as you know, USDA, free lunch, but also Title I. The largest grant we actually get, aside from USDA, is actually IDEA, which is the special education grant. It's literally billions of dollars. And for all that, Massachusetts is, is billions of dollars in on Chapter 70, and we do have things like the Fair Share Amendment, which, by the way, is part of how we're funding free lunch. I not only haven't seen planning, but I would be sort of, just from the bits that I know about the state budget, I would be surprised if there was an effort to do that. I realize that is not good news. I wish it were better.
Okay, so basically you're saying that if we lose the federal funding, it's going to be very difficult on our students.
Absolutely. The one thing I will say is this, because we've had some conversations, those of us who do this work nationally talk to each other. The thing to remember is that what is true here is just as true in every single state in the entire United States. And part of the reason that both USDA funding, which both free lunch funding, which is partly actually a subsidization of agriculture, by the way, keep that in mind, and things like Title I and Title III and so forth are very popular, is because they benefit everyone. And honestly, if you look proportionally speaking, Massachusetts, as honestly we've just covered, is a state that puts a lot of both local and state capacity into funding public schools. We have one of the highest sort of proportions of that nationally, us, New Jersey, a couple of other states. It is states who you might assume would potentially support the loss of federal funding that actually proportionately would lose more because they're much more heavily dependent on federal aid to fund their schools. And that is something that is sort of just generally known. So at least traditionally speaking, those have been, while people like to talk about the sort of the hows and the wherefores and the what's attached to what kind of thing, generally speaking, that kind of funding for schools has been bipartisanly popular, again, because it benefits everyone. I make no promises, but that is an observation I would have.
And your organization will keep us up to date on any information you get?
Absolutely. Our board, the National School Boards Association had an advocacy institute, I believe it was last week. We had several members of our board that were there, and they were, visiting Congress. Actually, you may have seen, we actually had, Senator Markey was actually at the Department of Education a couple of days ago. A congressman, the congressional delegation have been out in front of this as well. But they were very much part of that. So yes, we're getting, I personally am a member of the Association of School Business Officers International, which is the national school finance people, but then also MASC is a member of NSBA. Sorry to use a lot of acronyms there. So we're keeping apprised on both sides.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from members? Going once? Going twice? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And let me just note this. You all have my contact information. If this is the sort of thing where you kind of felt like you had it and then you wake up tomorrow morning and go, that doesn't make any sense to me at all anymore, please feel free to send me an email. I'm always more than happy to take those conversations.
Thank you.
Right, we will move on to agenda item number 6, subcommittee report, operating protocols ad hoc subcommittee. Chairman Carlo.
Yeah, our subcommittee met. That was Frank and Brittany. We met on January 22nd, and we also met on February 5th. And all subcommittee members were in attendance on both dates. And then I submitted the agenda item number 7 for a vote.
Thank you. We'll move on to agenda item number 7, vote to approve the operating protocols and adopt effective immediately. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Do I have a second? All right, I'll open the floor for discussion. If any members have any questions or Any comments in regards? Feel free. Go ahead, Ms. Shea.
On the introduction paragraph, number 2, it says budgets for public education in the district and there's nothing after the and.
I believe that just transitions to point number 3. The and is used as a transitional point. That you establish educational goals and policies for the schools in the district consistent with requirements of law, statewide goals and standards established by the Board of Education. Number 2, review and approve budgets for public education in the district. And number 3, select, evaluate annually, and if necessary, terminate the superintendent.
Okay, you're at least going to have to get rid of the comma. It's very, very confusing look. I think you just leave a period and go on with the select.
Okay?
And also, on section meetings, the last bullet point, if a school committee member is unable to attend in person due to illness, family emergency, etc., they may be joined virtually. Do we have a procedure set up for virtual meetings yet?
Yes, so if a member, moving forward, once this is adopted, if a member can't make it and they know ahead of time, we'll post our agendas with a meeting, a virtual meeting link in order to get to it, with also the call-in information as well. That would be posted on the agenda prior to the 48 hours.
Okay.
So essentially, if you're out, say you call us and you say you're not going to be able to come in because you're not feeling too well, before the agenda is posted, we would create that meeting room, schedule that meeting time for the meeting, for the meeting itself, and then you would be able to join in virtually therein.
How much advanced knowledge do you have?
It would still have to be posted to the public.
No, but I mean, say I was sick, and I got sick this morning.
Just generally speaking, like if you know you're not.
Miss Carla is shaking her head. Do you have any idea
No, I was going to say if it's that day, we can't make any changes to the agenda because we have to give the public 48 hours in advance.
Then you'd have to delineate it in this particular section. With 48 hours notice, you could. Because I would, from this, I would assume that I could call in, 4:30. I think I'll just stay home. It's snowing, and I don't do snow.
Okay. Is there anything else? All right. Are there any other questions or comments regarding the operating protocols?
So does that, what we just changed, should never have been or allowed to be 24? It always has to be 48?
Yeah, it has to be 48 hours in accordance with open meeting law. So that because we still have to, if we're going to hold the meeting virtually as well as in public, it has to be posted as such in a proper amount of time for the public to have general knowledge.
Isn't the virtual portion just, the purpose of it is just to allow that person to be in attendance to the meeting, not an access issue to the meeting?
No, we would have
it changes nothing about content, what's being presented, it just...
Correct, but
Right.
if we are going to allow members to join the dais virtually, we would have to also allow members of the public to join the meeting virtually also. So it would still have to be posted 48
Okay,
hours
so
in advance.
If we had a virtual, one member needed the virtual, then it would have to be open to the whole community?
The meeting would have to be, yes, and we would have to moderate that at that point, but we would, generally speaking, everybody would be muted, the member would be allowed to speak if the
Well, I
time...
can understand the member.
Yes.
It's once you have one member doing it virtually, that means then that anyone could do it virtually?
We would have to open the link up to the public, yes.
Although the purpose for this here, stated in this bullet point, is due to illness, family emergency, business trip. So how are we How are we knowing that these are the reasons the public cannot attend?
Well, so in order for, the reason why this would be in the operating protocols as such is if you are joining virtually, you would still be able to vote on anything that would be in the agenda with the advance notice as a member. If we don't, then you wouldn't be able to vote, essentially. So like if we don't have the virtual meeting, you can't join in, you're out that day. You're just not here. You can't vote in absentia. You would have to be present in the meeting in order to vote. If you join us virtually, you would be present in the meeting and have the ability to cast a vote.
Sure, but it's a good point, but not the one I was speaking to. I was just speaking to the public's needing the same access a member is, and this is only granted under these conditions of illness. So if you're saying this is how the member needs, these are the only stipulations. These are stipulations for you to attend virtually, otherwise you should be here. And so you're mentioning that this same option would need to be extended to the public, so these same requirements, I would guess, would be fall upon the public as well as us. They would have to be ill or et
So
cetera, et
this is
cetera.
for you to be able to vote,
Yeah.
essentially. The public can join in as needed, but for you to be able to join the meeting virtually and have the ability to cast a vote, it has to be due, as a member, it would have to be due to illness, a family emergency, or business trip. If the public would like to join virtually to watch the meeting and observe, they have more than welcome to do so regardless of the reason. If you want to join as a member of the public because you don't want to cast a vote or you can't for some reason, then you could join the meeting, but in order for us to be able to consider you in attendance, we would have to post it 48 hours in advance. That would give you, as a member, the ability to vote on something that was on the agenda. If we weren't able to post it that way, this would only essentially unable to attend just counts as whether or not you have voting rights in the meeting. Members of the public generally do not have voting rights in a public meeting. So the standard for the public would not be the same as for us. If we're going to grant you the voting rights, it has to be based on you're joining due to an illness, you're joining to a family emergency, or you're joining virtually based on a business trip. That still allows you to be in and vote, but no, if it's not one of those and you're in attendance, you wouldn't have the ability to vote on an agenda item.
So the only way the public has this virtual right to join the meeting is if one of the members is using that form to attend the meeting in order to vote?
Correct. So if we don't post the meeting, if we don't have a virtual option for the public to join, and we don't have a hybrid as an option at all, and everybody says that they're going to be here in attendance, and all 7 show up on the dais, there's no virtual meeting. This particular point is moot. It would only come up if somebody says, hey, I'm going to be going on a business trip.
No, yeah, I got that part.
So-
It's just the connection to public invitation that I was addressing. Okay.
Yes.
Carla was first.
I'm wondering if maybe we should do it hybrid moving forward, and that way if folks want to join online, they can, and then we don't have to make it an as if a member is blank.
Yeah, we would just have to coordinate. I don't have an issue with it, and I think that's a great idea. The redevelopment authority does it. We, ever since COVID, our meetings are both in person and are hybrid. So we always have a go-to meeting set up. We unfortunately rarely get members of the public joining, but I don't have any issues with doing it. We just have to coordinate with the cable department to make sure that it's going to be viable consistently. So just verifying with them that we can set that up, and we should be okay.
I agree with Carla, because I think as a community member, I would find it requiring me to really read the fine print every single month. Is this one going to be hybrid? If it's hybrid, how do I get in touch? Because you said you would send me the access point, but if it's open, then it's open.
Yes, so we would moderate it essentially, and you would be the only person that would be allowed to speak as far as during agenda items. The members of the public that want to join virtually would have to go through our public input policy in order to speak, but they would have to sign up and say that they were coming in virtually, and they would still be relegated to the same things during public input. After that, the members of the public would be muted. But I think doing it hybrid consistently is gonna, once we get over that first hump of the growing pains of everybody getting used to it, because we did with the redevelopment authority, it's been a pretty much seamless transition. Once you get a few of the hybrid meetings under your belt and you understand the dynamic of how it works, it works out better. And it does, we have noticed that we have gotten some people coming in, especially, we just had people join the RDA one because we were doing something in regards to art. We did have a couple of members join, so it is helpful and beneficial to have that hybrid as an option, but we just, again, would have to weigh it out with the cable, and we'd have to moderate it properly, but that just goes on, again, conducting a meeting in proper order. Just, we'd have to get used to the new dynamic, and it would just be some growing pains of getting used to a new procedure. Did anybody else have any input? So, going once? I don't want to skip anybody or leave anybody out. All right, so we have amended a couple of things. We are removing a comma off of the introductory.
And I thought we'd just get rid of the "and" altogether and just put a period.
Okay, so we're getting rid of the "and." And we are also under meetings in the last one. We are changing that to 48 hours in advance, 48 instead of 28. Or, excuse me, 24. Okay. Are there any other corrections? Or edits? So, what's that?
Are we adding the hybrid or no?
I don't think we need to necessarily put that at this time in there. And then when we review it in 6 months, because the new committee will review the operating protocols, so this should be an annual review. We can move to codify that more once we get used to it. Do we have any other amendments? Seeing none, since the original document has been amended, do I have a motion to accept and adopt the Southbridge School Committee norms, operating protocols, as amended?
So moved.
I have a motion, second from Norma. All of those, we'll do a roll call vote. Carla De La Cruz Davila,
Yes. Yes.
Frank Kepinski,
Yes.
Martina Shea,
No, I can't support it until we straighten out that language on the issue of who gets to talk and when they get to talk and how we'll set up the visual ability to share.
Maria Torres,
Yes.
Norma Tisnick.
Yes.
All right, the motion does pass 5-1. Agenda item number 8, discussion and progress meeting expectations as outlined in DESI plan to build school committee capacity. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to start with a new member. Ms. Shea, we will start with you this evening.
When Brittany and I went to see Dr. Villar, he talked about the elevator at West Street. Apparently, it's been out of service since August. He's brought the issue to the town council, to the town manager, and as yet there has been no funding. It's a very expensive procedure, but with disability rules in Massachusetts, we have to have a functioning elevator. It is a capital expense, so it's not something that we can take out of our regular budget. I was hoping Brittany would remember the number, but I think it was at least $100,000. So we'd like to have the town council act on that as soon as possible.
Okay, any school visits also, since our last meeting, our last independent school committee meeting? Nope. All right. Mr. Kibinski.
Nothing new to report. My next meeting, I'm thinking should be with Dr. Villar. I've seen not most schools, 2 or 3 to this point, including last year. So I think it would probably be beneficial, be my first time meeting with him. Been on the committee now, almost 2 years, so, yeah.
Ms. Torres?
I will be meeting this week with Dr. Villar, and it's something that I will be bringing up to discuss with him on further plan on the DESI plan.
Ms. Dalman?
Yeah, I've met regularly with Dr. Villar, with you, with Juan. We did the ad hoc committee. I've done school visits with Brittany and then with Norma. I went to Charlton Street School, and we also went to Southbridge Academy. I went to the award ceremony where both Norma and I were surprised to see what was happening. We had no idea, but it was a big secret, I guess. So we were happily surprised to see what was going on, and it was really nice to see that one of our teachers was awarded, which was amazing. So I was really happy to be there. I'm sure Norma was too, but she could talk as well. We did the joint meeting with the town council for our newly elected members. Congratulations, ladies. Thank you so much for all you've done. Trying to think what else. I just went to the CPAC meeting that was recently done, a community forum regarding like a new housing project. And I think that's all of it. And I also started what they call a fellowship for the school board partners. And essentially what it is to help me with like mentorship, policy support, and I also get to meet like 75 other elected officials nationally, which I think is a plus since we're all learning. So I get to learn from other individuals as well. So I'm excited about that. It's a one-year term that we do, but I continue to have their support moving forward. So happy to be part of that. And I think there's only 2 other folks, one from Dudley Charlton, and I think in the Brookfields. The rest are all over the place. Sorry. And I think that's it for me.
And lastly, Member Tisnick.
Excuse me, I do have a scheduled meeting with Dr. Villar approaching soon. I had the ability and the what I call honor to be able to be present in the middle school teacher honorary this past Friday. It was a great opportunity for me to, I felt it was a great, introduction in this whole entire new journey. Being a part of the committee, I was also able to do a tour at the academy with Carla and another of the administration. And I think that was about it.
Alrighty. So, unfortunately, our meeting with the commissioner was canceled on the 6th, so we were due to the weather. We are waiting on a new date from the interim commissioner's office to meet. We also, I've met regularly with Dr. Villar. I communicate with him on pretty much the 3 to 5 days a week. At this point, I've also met regularly with Vice Chair Shea. Also just recently had a meeting with Vice Chair Shea. That is so mean, I'm sorry. Vice Chair Davila. And I also met with Member Davison in a joint meeting with them. I also have a meeting scheduled with Ms. Shea and Mr. Kapinski for next week, the 18th. And Vice Chair and I also have a meeting with Representative Marcy virtually coming up on February 25th as well. I do also want to offer congratulations to both members that were approved pretty well handedly by a joint meeting. And the fact that you guys are diving right in, I think I appreciate jumping right into the DESI plan, even though you're coming in part of the way through. We have pretty well covered phase 1, a large portion of them. One of the last key factors we just approved tonight with these operating protocols, or the school committee norms. So we will continue to move forward as best as we can. Once we get, once we get from the commissioner's office that we are able to move into phase 2, Carla and I will just dive right in, as you all have. So we only went without a full school committee for about 30 days, which I think is pretty impressive, given our current status without having any true authority. So that just goes to a testament that people stepped up, multiple people stepped up because of the work that we are all doing up here to stick with this plan and help transition towards the end of receivership, and is very important and has already had a visible effect. Our monthly meetings with Dr. Villar will be regularly scheduled. I personally have meetings, also school visits scheduled for March 4th and March 25th. If I can get other dates in between, I will do my best, coordinating with Dr. Villar's office. And I was originally that presentation for the middle school was scheduled for the 6th. So I am super appreciative that you two were able to attend. Unfortunately, I had the day off of work for that Thursday, but not that Friday. I believe we've made great strides. If you have any questions, if any member has any questions as far as where we're at, go ahead and reach out to Juan with those questions. In discussion that Carla and I have had with our biweekly check-ins with him, we've covered a lot. Even, kind of adding a notch into it by reaching out to Representative Marcy to set up a meeting with him. I've reached out to Senator Fatman's office. I should hear back relatively soon to get a meeting with the senator as well. So I think we are doing a fantastic job. Even as we move into budget season, that is our next meeting. Our next regularly scheduled school committee meeting will be March 11th. At 7 p.m. in council chambers. If that time changes, because it is, the public hearing for the budget will be held before that at 6:30. So the expectation is that we are here at 6:30 for the public hearing on the budget. And then we will move directly thereafter into our regularly scheduled school committee meeting. If anything changes, Carl and I will make sure that the members are updated. Yes, Ms. Shea.
Are we going to get some information on the budget before the public hearing?
I would presume so. Yes.
Are we going to need a meeting, or are we just going to get the paperwork? Are we going to get an explanation? He's always given us an explanation before the public.
Yep, and I don't expect that to change. So I would just, any updates we'll get from Dr. Villar's office, and we'll communicate them with the committee. If we have to have a meeting prior and that date will change, obviously, we will make sure that the committee is informed appropriately.
Okay,
therein.
thank you.
This is just based on the standard.
Yeah, I think one of the requirements in our DC plan was that Dr. Villar would meet with us about the budget. Wasn't that one of the guidelines?
Technically, we're still in phase 1. We haven't been able to meet with
Technically
the
in phase
commissioners
1,
on-
but it's been a tradition all along that he would present the budget to us and then to the public.
Yes, so as he's presented it in years past, it's done as a public hearing with the school committee, and then we immediately move into our school committee. That's how it's been done.
Okay.
So we'll get that initial presentation, and that will be that will be the first public hearing on it, and then he'll continue to move forward going through AHS and then necessarily going through the town, as noted, but we will still be the first.
Okay.
Yes.
I almost forgot, when I went to Charlton Street School, they gave me swag, and I told them I would give them a shout out, so thank you for my swag. So the rest of you better give me swag too, thanks.
So we
Go
are now
Charlton
going
Street.
to, so now we're going to invite friendly competition between school buildings for swag. That is awesome. I'm for it.
Me too.
A collaborative effort to make sure Miss Carla gets all the cool t-shirts. They have them in kid sizes. I can probably grab one for myself. On that note, is there any other members? Yes,
I
Ms.
just-
Torres and then Ms. Shea.
Thank you, Chairman, through you.
pointing.
In addition, I also do attend the CPAC meetings monthly, I highly recommend that you guys all go and log in virtually. It's very informative to understand a little bit more of, how we can continue moving forward with the CPAC as well, which would be beneficial for the DESI plan as well. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Unanimous, all present. This meeting is adjourned.